The last light of evening bled over the frozen river near the town of Cold Creek, staining the snow the color of old wounds. 8-year-old Ruth Janek trudged along the icy bank, her boots punching through the crust with each step, the lantern swinging in her mittened hand, casting wild shadows across the drifts. The biting chill cut through her thin wool dress as if the fabric were made of cobwebs. Her father had sent her to find the missing calf before the storm closed in, but the animal was nowhere, and the numbing cold was beginning to bite deep into her bones. She stopped short, her breath catching in her throat. An elderly native woman lay on a woven reed mat at the water's edge, slumped on one hip, her long braids crusted white with frost. Her doe-skin dress was torn along the shoulder, smeared with dried blood that had turned black in the frigid air. Beaded necklaces rose and fell faintly at her throat. Her eyes were nearly closed, lashes frozen together in delicate spikes. Ruth's heart hammered against her ribs. She thought of her mother, who had died 2 winters past, from the fever wrapped in a blanket, much like the one Ruth now wore. Her mother had been cold at the end, so cold that no fire could warm her. Ruth had promised herself she would never let anyone freeze if she could help it. But her father would be furious. She had been gone too long already. He would yell maybe worse. And if he found out she had stopped to help a native stranger, he would say she was foolish, reckless, that she was risking all of them. A wolf howled closer than before. Ruth's head snapped toward the sound. Through the blue twilight, she saw movement on the ridge, dark shapes slinking between the pine's eyes, gleaming yellow in the dying light. The wolves were hungry. The winter had been cruel, and they had grown bold, venturing closer to homesteads, dragging off livestock and small animals. A child alone would be easy prey. Ruth dropped to her knees, setting the lantern between her and the woman. Her breath fogged the air in rapid bursts. The woman's lips were blue. One hand lay curled against her chest, the fingers dark and swollen. "You'll freeze out here," Ruth whispered, though she did not know if the woman could hear her. With clumsy child hands, Ruth lifted the rough gray blanket from her own shoulders, the only one she owned, the one her mother had sewn with careful stitches before the fever took her, and tucked it over the woman's chest, smoothing it up to her chin. Snowflakes settled on Ruth's hair, melting into cold trickles down her neck. The lantern flickered its flame, dancing in the wind. The river ice groaned beneath the surface, a deep, restless sound that made Ruth's skin prickle. She knew she should run home. But if she left now, this stranger would be a body by morning, stiff and blue under a blanket that would do no good. Ruth gripped the edge of the woven mat and pulled. The woman was small, but the mat dragged heavy across the crunchy shore. Ruth's legs shook with effort. The lantern swung beside them through the dusk, and the wolves howled again, their voices thin and hungry, carried on the howling gusts that swept down from the mountains. By the time Ruth reached the distant shape of her family's barn, her hands were numb, her face burning with cold, and the storm had begun in earnest. Behind her, the wolves followed at a distance, their shapes barely visible in the swirling white. By dawn, the woman lay inside the drafty barn, near the hay bales, and the old mule that John Janek was too poor to replace. The air smelled of livestock, old straw, and the faint, acrid tang of wood smoke drifting from the house. A thin layer of frost had formed on the inside of the barn walls, glittering in the pale morning light. Ruth sat beside the stranger, wrapped in a horse blanket, watching the rise and fall of the woman's chest. Each breath was shallow, labored a faint whistle in the cold air. Her father stood near the door, pacing his gaunt face tight with worry. John Janek was a Bohemian immigrant, a man who had come west with dreams of fertile land, and found only hard dirt debt and disappointment. His hands were calloused and cracked from labor, his back bent from years of breaking soil that refused to yield. His temper was short-sharpened by hunger and fear. He stared at the beaded necklaces around the woman's throat, the intricate patterns that spoke of a people he did not understand, and muttered, We'll have trouble for this girl. You brought trouble right to our door." Ruth did not answer. She had carried the woman here, and she would not apologize for it. Her mother had taught her that much: when someone is dying, you do not walk away. Cold Creek had been simmering for months, a pot left too long on the fire. The town sat at the edge of the territorial boundary, a place where settlers and tribal bands had once traded peacefully furs for flower venison, for salt knowledge, for survival. But Percival Locke, a cattle baron, with ambitions as wide as the prairie and a heart as narrow as a rifle barrel, had arrived 2 years prior and begun stringing wire-digging ditches and damming sections of the river. He claimed he was improving the land, but what he was really doing was choking off access to water for both small settlers like John and the nearby Lakota bands who had lived there for generations. Wells were running dry. Livestock were dying, their ribs showing through dull coats. The winter had come early, and the snow lay hard on the prairie, driven by winds that knifed between the half-built shacks on the town's edge. Tempers frayed. Men drank more and spoke less. The local preacher had begun to preach about locusts and judgment, and no one laughed anymore. In town, Dr. Esther Milford stitched a miner's hand in her cramped office above the general store. She was a tired woman in her 40s, sharp-eyed and sharper-tongued, one of the few people in Cold Creek with formal education. She had trained in Philadelphia before the war, and she had come west because no man would work under her in the city hospitals. They had called her unsuitable and unnatural. And so she had packed her medical bag and headed for a place where people were too desperate to care about her gender. Now she treated gunshot wounds, frostbite, broken bones, and the slow poisoning of miners who worked too long in the silver pits upriver. "You keep pouring that mercury into the works," she said as she tied off the miner's stitches, her fingers steady despite the cold. "You're going to kill more than fish. I've seen 3 children this month with tremors and bleeding gums. That's mercury poisoning." The miner, a lean man with hollow eyes, grunted. "Ain't my decision, ma'am. Locke owns the Copper Creek Works. He says it washes downstream. Nobody notices." Esther's jaw tightened. "I notice. The dead notice." After the miner left, Esther stood at her window, watching the town below. Cold Creek was a ragged collection of buildings clinging to survival. A saloon, a general store, a blacksmith, a church with a crooked steeple, and a scattering of shacks where families huddled through the long winters. Beyond the town, the prairie stretched endlessly, white and silent and unforgiving. She thought of the sick children, the dying livestock, the way the river had begun to smell strange in the summer. Something was poisoning the valley, and she knew exactly who was responsible. At the same time, a Lakota war party watched from the ridge above the valley. Among them rode Hakan, a seasoned warrior from the plains, broad-shouldered with a scar along his jaw and a quiet way of studying everything before he spoke. He wore a wool coat over his buckskin shirt, and his rifle was slung across his back. His horse, a bay gelding with a white blaze, shifted beneath him, sensing his tension. The elder, who now lay in Ruth's barn, was Winema Hakan's aunt and a respected advisor in the tribal councils. She had left camp 3 days prior with a message for the winter council and had not returned. Hakan had tracked her path to the river's edge, where he found signs of a struggle, blood on the rocks, a broken necklace, hoof prints from shod horses. Hakan studied the smoke rising from the distant homesteads, the frozen river snaking through the valley, the sky heavy with the promise of more snow. He had seen the way the whites built their fences and dug their trenches, the way they took what they wanted and called it a progress. He had also seen the way they turned on each other when the land stopped giving. "We go down at first light," he said to the warriors gathered around him. "If she is alive, we bring her home. If she is dead, we bring her home." His warriors nodded. No one spoke of revenge yet, but the thought hung in the air like the coming storm. One of the younger warriors, a man named Tokala, leaned forward. "What if the settlers resist?" Hakan's gaze was steady. "Then we show them what it means to stand against us. But we do not strike first. Winema would not want that." Snow thickened over the prairie, and the river covering tracks, erasing boundaries, making the world a blank page on which anything might be written. Inside the barn, Ruth watched the woman breathe. She had never been this close to a native person before. Her father spoke of them with fear and suspicion, calling them hostiles and savages. But this woman looked nothing like the monsters he described. She looked old and tired and human. Ruth reached out and touched the woman's hand. It was cold, so cold. She pulled the blanket higher and whispered, "Please don't die. I didn't bring you all this way just so you could die." The woman's eyes fluttered open just for a moment. They were dark and clouded with pain. But there was something in them, recognition perhaps, or gratitude. Her lips moved, forming words Ruth could not hear. Then her eyes closed again, and Ruth sat back shivering in the frigid barn, wondering what she had begun. Mid-morning, the sound of hooves crunching through snow brought John Janek to the barn door with his shotgun in hand. Ruth scrambled to her feet, heart pounding. Through the narrow gap in the door, she saw them horsemen wrapped in furs and blankets, rifles slung across their backs. The lead rider was broad, and still his face unreadable beneath the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. Ruth raced from the barn boots, slipping on the ice, and planted herself in front of the door. Her breath came in short bursts, fogging the air. She was terrified, but she had made a choice last night, and she would stand by it. "She's in there," she said, chin trembling. "I gave her my blanket. Please don't hurt her." Hakan dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate. He read the fear in Jan's hunched shoulders, the way the farmer's knuckles were white on the shotgun. The man was terrified, but he had not fired. That was something. "We came for our elder," Hakan said in accented English, each word carefully chosen. "And to thank the child." John hesitated, his mind racing. He knew what this could mean. If word got out that he was harboring Indians, Locke would use it against him. The mortgage was already overdue. The cattle baron could seize the land with a single word. But the look on Ruth's face, pleading desperate, made him step aside. The warriors filed in their eyes, adjusting to the dim light. Winema lay near the hay bales, Ruth's gray blanket tucked up to her chin. Her breathing was shallow, her skin pale beneath the frost that still clung to her braids. Frostbite had turned her fingers black at the tips, and there was a bruised dent on the side of her head, as if she had been struck with something heavy, a pistol butt perhaps, or the stock of a rifle. Hakan knelt beside her, his large fingers hovering over the blanket. Winema's eyes fluttered open. She gripped his wrist with surprising strength and spoke in Lakota, her voice a rasp. Hakan's face darkened as he listened. When she finished, she released him and closed her eyes again. Ruth watched from the doorway, her hands clasped together. She did not understand the words, but she understood the look on Hakan's face, fury barely leashed. "What did she say?" Ruth whispered. Hakan turned to her, his expression softening slightly. "She said you saved her life. She said she owes you a debt." Before Ruth could respond, the sound of more hooves echoed from the yard. John cursed under his breath. A moment later, Maximilian Max Crow rode into the yard with 2 armed men. Max was Percival Locke's foreman, a lean man with a thin mustache and a smile that never reached his eyes. He wore a black duster and a silver-plated revolver on his hip, polished to a shine. "Morning, Janek," Max said, tipping his hat in a mockery of politeness. His gaze slid over the warriors in the barn and the shotgun in John's hands and settled on Ruth. "We're looking for some cattle that went missing in the storm. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you? No cattle here, John said, voice tight. Max's smile widened. Funny. We tracked him this way, and now I see you're harboring hostiles. That's a problem, Janek. A big problem. Guns lifted. The barn became a powder keg, everyone holding their breath, waiting for the spark. Ruth felt the tension pressing down on her like a physical weight. She looked at Håkon, then at her father, then at Max, and knew that one wrong word could end in blood. Then the sound of a buggy rattling into the yard broke the tension. Not Sterower. Esther Milford climbed down, her black bag in hand, her face flushed from the cold. She pushed between the men without asking permission and strode into the barn. I heard there was someone injured out here, she said, her voice brisk and professional. Where is she? She knelt beside Winema, opened her bag, and began her examination. The elder's pulse was weak, her breathing ragged. Esther peeled back the blanket and winced at the bruising on Winema's ribs, the ugly swelling around her temple. If you drag her out into that cold, Esther said, not looking up, she dies. Here at least she has a chance. Max spat into the snow. This ain't none of your business, Doc. Everything sick or dying in this valley is my business. Esther snapped, her eyes flashing. Now get out of my way before I have the army investigate why so many people are dying of mercury poisoning. Max's smile faltered. He tipped his hat again, this time mockingly, and rode away. But his eyes lingered on the barn, and Ruth felt a cold knot form in her stomach. This was not over. After Max and his men left, Esther worked in silence, cleaning Winema's wounds, wrapping her frostbitten fingers in clean cloth. Ruth watched, fascinated by the doctor's steady hands and the way she moved with confidence and purpose. You did a good thing, Esther said quietly, glancing at Ruth. Not many people would have. Ruth flushed. My mama used to say that if you can help someone, you should, even if it's hard. Esther smiled, a rare expression that softened her tired face. Your mama was a smart woman. Håkon stood near the door, speaking quietly with his warriors. They would leave a guard, he decided, and return to camp to report. But he would not forget the child who had saved his aunt. Before he left, he approached Ruth. She looked up at him, small and wide-eyed. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch, placing it in her hand. For your kindness, he said. Inside were dried berries and strips of smoked meat, simple gifts but valuable in a hard winter. Ruth's eyes filled with tears. Thank you. Håkon nodded once, then mounted his horse and rode away, his warriors following. But Ruth knew somehow that she would see him again. That night the storm hit in full. The barn shook in the wind, and snow piled against the walls in thick drifts. Ruth helped Esther tend to Winema by lantern light, fetching water, holding bandages, doing whatever the doctor asked. Her small hands were careful, her face serious. Esther found herself impressed by the girl's quiet competence. You're a natural, Esther said, watching Ruth dampen a cloth and press it gently to Winema's forehead. You ever think about becoming a doctor? Ruth shook her head. Girls can't be doctors. I'm a doctor, Esther said dryly. Ruth's eyes widened. But people don't like it, do they? Esther laughed, a short, bitter sound. No, they don't, but I do it anyway. Sometimes the right thing isn't the easy thing. As Ruth adjusted the blanket over Winema's chest, her fingers brushed something stiff stitched into the lining of the doe-skin dress. She tugged at it, curious, and felt the crinkle of oilskin. She pulled out a small packet sealed with wax. What's that? Esther asked, wiping her hands on a cloth. Ruth handed it over. Esther broke the seal and unfolded the contents, a worn ledger pages, dense with numbers and notes stamped with Percival Locke's personal seal. She held it close to the lantern and began to read, her eyes moving faster and faster. Entries listed barrels of mercury shipped to the Copper Creek Silver Works. Another column noted, waste tipped below Janek Bend. Names were signed in looping, hurried hands. Dates ranged back over 2 years. Esther's eyes narrowed. This was not just careless dumping. This was deliberate, systematic poisoning recorded in ink with full knowledge of the consequences. Blast. Esther breathed. This is evidence. Real evidence. Outside, a shadow moved near the barn wall. Max Crow had returned alone and now peered through a crack in the boards. He saw the ledger in Esther's hands, saw the way her face had gone white, and knew exactly what it was. Within hours, Percival Locke himself rode out flanked by armed men. He was a tall man with silver hair and a voice like polished iron, a man who had made his fortune through ruthlessness and cunning. He knocked once on the barn door and then pushed it open without waiting for an answer. "I hear you have something that belongs to me." He said, his tone pleasant, but his eyes cold. John stepped forward, choking on fear and debt. Locke owned John's mortgage. One word from the cattle baron, and the homestead was gone. The land seized Ruth, left with nothing. "I don't want trouble, Mr. Locke," John said, his voice cracking. "Then give me my ledger." Esther stood, placing herself between Locke and the wounded elder. "This ledger is evidence of a crime. You've been poisoning the water for 2 years. People are dying." Locke's smile was cold. "That's a serious accusation, Doctor. I hope you can prove it. Otherwise, you're just a hysterical woman with a stolen book." John remembered something then, a memory that had been buried under fear and shame. 2 years ago, Locke had hired him to haul barrels from the mine to the river. John had thought they were empty, but one had cracked open, spilling thick, silvery liquid that smelled like death. John had refused to haul any more after that, and Locke had threatened him, told him he would lose everything if he spoke. John had kept silent, terrified, and the guilt had gnawed at him ever since. A gust of wind ripped a loose plank from the barn roof. It crashed down toward Ruth, spinning through the air. Hakan, who had returned quietly through the storm to check on his aunt, moved faster than anyone expected. He yanked Ruth clear, taking a splinter in his shoulder as the plank clattered to the ground. Ruth clung to him, shaking. Hakan's jaw was tight, his hand steady on her shoulder. Locke saw the way the warriors shielded the child and understood the ledger was inside with them, and they were not going to hand it over. "Fine," Locke said, voice like ice. "Tomorrow the sheriff will come. We'll settle what belongs to who." He turned and walked out, his men following. But the threat hung heavier than the storm clouds overhead. After Locke left, John collapsed onto a hay bale, his face in his hands. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I should have said something. I should have stopped him." Esther put a hand on his shoulder. "You were afraid. We all are. But now we have proof. We can stop him." Ruth looked up at Hakan, who was pulling the splinter from his shoulder without flinching. "Are you hurt?" He shook his head. "I have had worse." Ruth reached into her pocket and pulled out the pouch he had given her. She offered it back. "You should take this. You'll need it more than me." Hakan smiled, a rare expression. "Keep it. You earned it." Esther paced the barn floor, her boots crunching on scattered straw. The lantern cast long shadows on the walls, and outside the wind howled like a living thing. If we keep the ledger here, Locke will simply bring the law to seize it. We need distance and witnesses beyond Cold Creek. She paused, thinking. There's a winter trading camp near Lonesome Pine. I heard a visiting army officer is there inspecting Indian complaints about poisoned water. Hakan, who had been tending to his shoulder, looked up. How far? 2 days' ride in good weather. With this storm, maybe 3. Winema stirred on her mat. Her eyes opened, clouded with pain. She spoke in Lakota, then switched to rough English for Ruth's benefit. "You took my blanket." She murmured each word in effort. "So I take your barn. Safe together." Hakan knelt beside her. "We will move you." She shook her head, her hand gripping his wrist. "Too late. Go. Stop him. For the children." Hakan's jaw tightened, but he nodded. He would not waste the time she was giving them. They left her in Ruth's care with John standing awkward guard. Esther gave John instructions on how to keep Winema warm, how to give her water, how to watch for signs of infection. John nodded, though his hands shook. At first light, Hakan and Ruth rode out. Ruth wore an oversized coat stuffed with rags for warmth, her small body pressed against Hakan's back as his bay gelding picked its way through the drifts. The ledger was wrapped in oilskin and tucked inside Hakan's shirt, pressed against his skin for safekeeping. They had barely cleared the ridge when Locke's riders spotted them. Shouts echoed across the valley. Bullets cracked through the air, kicking up sprays of snow. Hakan spurred his horse into a gallop, veering toward the frozen river. The ice was treacherous, uneven, but it was the fastest route. "Lie flat!" Hakan shouted over the roar of the wind. Ruth pressed herself against his back, her face buried in the rough wool of his coat. The horse's hooves slipped and skidded on the ice, each step a gamble. Behind them, a rider following too closely crashed through a weak patch, the ice shattering like glass. The man and his horse disappeared into the black water with a scream that cut off abruptly. The other riders pulled up short, unwilling to risk the same fate. Hakan pushed on through a low canyon lined with spruce where the wind howled between the trees, and distant wolves watched from the ridgeline. When night fell, he found a shallow overhang and dug out a space in the snow, creating a windbreak. He built a tiny fire shielded from the wind, and they huddled close to the embers. Ruth's teeth chattered uncontrollably. Hakan cut strips of frozen meat with his knife and showed her how to warm them over the coals, his large fingers briefly closing over hers, guiding her hands. "Like this," he said. "Slow. Too fast, you burn it." Ruth watched his face in the firelight. "Why are you helping me?" Hakan was silent for a long moment. "You helped my aunt. You did not have to. You could have walked away, but you did not. My mama said we should help people." Hakan nodded. "Your mother was wise." They ate in silence, the fire crackling between them. Ruth thought about her mother, the way she had smiled even when she was sick, the way she had taught Ruth to sew and cook and be kind. She wished her mother were here now. "Tell me about your aunt," Ruth said. Hakan's expression softened. "Winema is... She has lived many winters. She has seen much. She speaks for peace when others speak for war. She carries messages between camps, between tribes, sometimes even between our people and yours. She believes we can live together, share the land. Many do not agree, but she keeps trying. That's why she was at the river," Ruth said, understanding. "She was carrying a message." Hakan nodded. "And someone tried to stop her." Ruth pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "We'll stop them. We'll get the ledger to the army." Hakan looked at her, this small child, with fierce determination in her eyes, and felt something shift in his chest. "Yes," he said. "We will." Back in Cold Creek, Locke stirred the town. He called a meeting at the saloon, standing on a table so everyone could see him. The room was packed, men pressed shoulder to shoulder, the air thick with the smell of whiskey and sweat. "The hostiles are stealing company property," Locke declared, his voice ringing through the room. "They're plotting an uprising. They killed one of my men at the river. How many more have to die before we act?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Fear and anger mixed. Guinevere Marsh, the young schoolteacher, stood near the back, her hands clasped together. She protested timidly. "I've seen sick Indian children at my door, Mr. Locke. They're coughing up blood. Maybe it's the water. Maybe it's their own filth." Locke snapped, his eyes flashing. "You want to side with savages, Miss Marsh. That's your business. But don't drag the rest of us down with you." Guinevere fell silent, her face flushing. But that night, she and Esther sat together in the doctor's office, drafting a telegram to an army investigator in Rain Valley. They described the ledger, the dates, the names, the evidence of systematic poisoning. "Do you think it will reach anyone in time?" Guinevere asked, her voice trembling. Esther stared at the lamplight flickering on the wall. "I don't know, but we have to try." Guinevere looked down at her hands. "I'm afraid Locke has so much power here. If he finds out we sent this, then we'll face it together," Esther said firmly. "We're not alone in this. We have each other, and we have the truth." Guinevere nodded, drawing strength from the older woman's resolve. They sealed the telegram and gave it to the telegrapher, a nervous man, who promised to send it first thing in the morning. As they walked back through the snowy streets, Guinevere spoke quietly. "Why does he do it? Why poison the water?" "Because it's cheaper," Esther said bitterly. "Disposing of mercury waste properly costs money. Dumping it in the river is free. And as long as the people dying are Indians or poor settlers, he doesn't care." Guinevere shivered, not from the cold. "What kind of man does that?" "The kind who values money more than lives," Esther said. "The kind we have to stop." On the third day, Hakan and Ruth reached an abandoned shack near the Copper Creek mine, a halfway point where they were to meet Esther. The shack was little more than 4 walls and a sagging roof with broken windows that let the wind scream through. The sky outside was the color of hammered lead, heavy with the promise of another storm. Ruth's legs ached from riding. Her face was raw from the wind. But she did not complain. She had learned over these 3 days that survival meant endurance. Esther arrived by sled, her face raw from the cold, her breath coming in gasps. She climbed down, stumbling on stiff legs, and took the ledger from Hakan with shaking hands. She flipped through the pages, scanning the entries, her eyes moving faster and faster. Then she stopped, her face drained of color. She turned the ledger toward the light, as if hoping she had read it wrong. But the words did not change. There, in careful slanted script, was a familiar name, John Janek. Next to it, Teamster agreed to haul barrels waste dump below Janek Bend. Payment, $20. Ruth, who had been warming her hands by the small fire, looked up. "What is it?" Esther swallowed hard. She hesitated, not wanting to hurt the child, but knowing there was no gentle way to do this. She turned the ledger so Ruth could see. "I'm sorry, Ruth. I'm so sorry." Ruth read the lines slowly, her lips moving. The color drained from her face. Her hands began to shake. "My papa helped them," she whispered, her voice breaking. Hakan's jaw tightened. He said nothing, but his eyes were hard. Esther knelt beside Ruth, placing a hand on her shoulder. Maybe he didn't know what he was hauling. Maybe Locke lied to him. "But his name is there," Ruth said, tears spilling down her cheeks. "In ink. He took money." Ruth remembered something then. A few months ago, she had heard her father arguing with someone outside the barn. She had been inside feeding the chickens, and the voices had been low and angry. She had heard Locke's name, heard her father say something about dirty barrels and "I won't do it no more." She had not understood at the time, and she had been too afraid to ask. Now it made sense. Her father had hauled the poison. He had helped Locke kill people. "He stopped," Ruth said suddenly, desperately. He said no more. I heard him. He argued with someone. He must have stopped when he found out. Esther squeezed her shoulder. Maybe. We don't know the whole story yet. Outside, the sound of hooves on crunching snow interrupted them. Shouts echoed through the canyon. Locke's riders had followed their trail. Gunfire exploded. Glass shattered, spraying the interior with shards. Hakon shoved Ruth and Esther toward the back of the shack, then fired through the front window. A bullet chipped the cast-iron stove behind him. Another sliced through his upper arm, tearing fabric and flesh. He grunted but kept firing, his face set in grim determination. The old mine powder shed nearby rattled as a stray shot clipped a loose board, igniting a splash of black powder left over from blasting operations. The shed erupted in a deafening blast, a column of flame and smoke punching into the sky. The ground shook. The roof of the shack partially caved in, showering them with dirt splinters and chunks of ice. Ruth screamed, covering her head. Esther grabbed her, pulling her toward the back exit. Hakon fired one more shot, then followed his shoulder, bleeding freely. They escaped out the back, stumbling through the smoke as the riders regrouped. The ledger, hastily stuffed in Esther's medical bag, survived. Hakon's left shoulder bled freely, slowing him. Ruth clung to Esther, coughing, her face streaked with soot and tears. They ran through the trees, slipping on ice, their breath ragged. Behind them, the riders shouted, but the explosion had scattered them, and the smoke provided cover. When they finally stopped hidden in a dense thicket of pines, Ruth collapsed, sobbing. "My papa is a bad man," she choked out. "He killed people." Esther held her close. "We don't know that yet. We don't know the whole story." But the doubt had been planted, and it grew like a weed in Ruth's heart. While they struggled through the wilderness, trying to find another route to Lonesome Pine, things worsened back at the farm. Locke's men, frustrated by the failed ambush and the loss of men to the explosion, rode to John's homestead. They dragged him from the barn, threw him to the ground, and beat him bloody. His ribs cracked under their boots. His face swelled until he could barely see. They kicked him until he could not stand, and then hauled him up and shoved a foreclosure document under his nose, the ink still wet. "Sign it," Max Crow said, pressing a pistol against Jan's ribs. "Sign it, or I put a bullet in you right here." Jan's hands trembled as he took the pen. He thought of Ruth, wondered where she was, if she was safe. He signed the letters, shaky and uneven. "Good," Max said, holstering his pistol. "Now you got nothing. No land, no barn, no daughter. You're done, Janek." After the riders left, John dragged himself back into the barn, every movement agony. Winema, propped on her mat near the door, watched with cloudy eyes. She had been drifting in and out of consciousness for days, her strength fading. She called for water in a voice like rustling leaves. John's hands trembled as he brought it, ashamed and furious. He held the cup to her lips, and she drank, her throat working slowly. "You are not the only man with a mark in a book," she whispered, her English labored. "What matters is what you do now." John's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know what was in those barrels. Not at first. When I found out, I stopped. I told Locke I wouldn't haul no more. But I should have said something. I should have told someone." Winema's hand found his, her grip weak. "You were afraid. Fear makes us small. But there is still time. Help them finish this." That night, she slipped into unconsciousness and never woke again. John sat beside her until dawn, holding her cold hand, weeping for all the things he had done and all the things he had failed to do. When Hakon, Ruth, and Esther finally staggered back into Cold Creek, having given up on reaching Lonesome Pine through the storm and deciding instead to confront Locke directly with the ledger, they found the town boiling. Locke had told everyone that John poisoned the river for money and conspired with hostiles to cover it up. He had painted John as a traitor, a man who had sold out his own people for silver. Sheriff Virgil Kane, a weary Civil War veteran who had long taken Locke's pay, saw an easy way to calm tensions. He arrested Jan for willful poisoning and conspiracy with hostiles. A rope was readied behind the jail. Townsfolk gathered angry and half-frozen, demanding quick justice before the storm worsened. Ruth saw the crowd and felt her heart stop. She pushed through the bodies, elbowing grown men aside until she reached the front. She saw her father through the jail window, his face bruised and swollen, his eyes full of shame and sorrow. "Papa!" she screamed, pounding on the bars. Jan looked up and his face crumpled. "Ruth, you shouldn't be here. You should run. Get away from this place." "I'm not leaving you," Ruth sobbed. Hakan tried to push through the crowd, but rifles raised toward him. Men shouted, "Get back, hostile, and you got no business here." He saw Ruth's terrified face behind the jail window and knew that one wrong move would put a bullet in her. For the moment, he was forced to back away, clutching his bandaged shoulder, watching the noose swing in the icy wind, his mind racing for a plan. Esther stood beside him, her face pale. "We need help. We can't stop this alone." Hakan looked at her, then at the crowd, then at the ridge beyond the town. "I know where to get it." Hakan rode through the storm-shrouded prairie to the Lakota winter camp near Indian Flats, pushing his wounded horse to the limit. Snow blinded him. His wound throbbed with each stride. Twice his mount stumbled near hidden ravines, its hooves slipping on ice-slick rock. Each misstep could break a leg and leave him to freeze. But Hakan pushed on, driven by the memory of Ruth's tear-streaked face, the sound of her screaming for her father. At camp, chiefs argued by firelight. The air was thick with smoke and tension. Some wanted open war. Others said the whites would use any excuse to crush them, to drive them further from the lands they had held for generations. Hakan dismounted stiffly and set the ledger on the ground, pages flapping in the smoke. His presence silenced the arguments. He was respected, a warrior, who spoke only when he had something worth saying. "These marks," he said, pointing at Locke's seal and the list of poisoned shipments, "are killing our children. The girl who saved Winnema's life, her father is blamed for it. Locke means to hang him and burn their barn book and all. If we let this happen, we are no better than the cowards who poison water and hide behind law." Skeptical faces softened at the mention of Winnema. She was loved. She had spoken for peace when others called for war. She had carried messages between camps when no one else would risk it. Her death, for they had heard she had passed, was not yet confirmed by ritual, but they could see it in Hakan's eyes. One of the elders, a man named Gray Owl, spoke. "If we ride in force, they will call it an act of war. The army will come. We will lose everything." Hakan nodded. "If we ride in force and show restraint, we show strength. We do not fire first. We stand as witness. We force them to see us, to hear us. If they fire first, the blame is theirs. The army will see that." Another chief, younger and angrier, stood. "And if they hang the farmer while we watch, what then?" "Then we have failed," Hakan said quietly. "But we will not fail. We will stand, and they will know we will not be ignored." After hours of debate, they reached a hard decision. They would ride in full strength, not to massacre, but to stand as a wall. If the whites fired first, the blame would be clear. If they did not, perhaps the presence of so many warriors would force the whites to listen. By pre-dawn, more than 700 warriors, Lakota and allied bands from across the valley, rode out a dark line against the snow. Feathers and blankets rippled in the wind. Rifles and bows glinted in the weak light. No war cries, no drums. Only the thunder of hooves, a sound that carried for miles, rolling across the frozen prairie like the voice of the earth itself. Back in Cold Creek, Locke pushed Virgil to move faster. The cattle baron was agitated, his control slipping. He could feel it in the way people looked at him, the way they whispered. The ledger was out there in the hands of people who would use it against him. He needed to end this decisively before the army arrived. "Hang the man, torch the barn," he snarled at Virgil. "Say he tried to escape. We end this before any army clerk from back east pokes his nose in." Virgil hesitated. He was tired, so tired. He had fought in the wars, seen enough death to last a lifetime. But Locke paid well, and Virgil had debts of his own. He nodded, hating himself. Ruth slipped from Guinevere's protective arm when no one was looking, and sneaked into the barn where her father was being held temporarily before the official hanging. She fumbled with the rope on his wrists, her fingers numb from cold and fear. "Papa, please, we have to run," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. John looked at her, his heart breaking. "There's nowhere to run, child. But you still can. You take that doctor woman's horse and you ride. You ride and don't look back. I won't leave you." A guard caught her, then yanking her away. He shoved her hard, her head struck a post, and she crumpled, dazed. Stars burst in her vision. Outside, men stacked brush around the barn. Locke intended to burn the structure with John inside, if anything went wrong, a cover story ready on his tongue. He would say the man had tried to escape, knocked over a lantern, caused the fire himself. It was perfect. No one would question it. As the first match was struck, a distant thunder rolled over the hills. Hooves, hundreds of them. The sound grew a deep rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself, until even Locke's men hesitated, lowering their torches, staring at the horizon. From the white haze of the storm, lines of mounted warriors emerged row after row, circling the farm in a tightening ring. They moved in silence, their faces unreadable, their rifles resting across their laps. The horses' breath steamed in the frigid air. Feathers and blankets rippled in the wind. In total, 700 riders formed a living wall around the barn and the gathered townsfolk. Ruth staggered to the doorway, clutching her bruised head, and stared in stunned awe. She had never seen so many people at once. The sight was overwhelming, terrifying, and somehow beautiful. She recognized Hakan at the front, snow crusting his braids, his eyes locked on Locke. No one talked. Even the horses seemed to hold their breath. The only sound was the wind howling across the valley. Captain Dorian Wells, leading a small army detachment that had arrived in town that morning in response to the telegram, rode up, his face pale. He was a young officer, barely 30, and this was not a situation they had trained him for. He had no orders for this. Locke hissed in his ear, demanding he disperse the hostile mob. But the captain studied the scene, burn pile noose, one bound farmer ledger clutched in Esther's gloved hand, and refused. "I'll not start a war over your mortgage, Locke." Dorian said, his voice shaking but firm. "We'll hear everyone." Locke's face twisted with fury. He was losing control, and he knew it. Hakan rode forward, lifting the ledger high above his head so everyone could see. "This book," he called out in clear English, his voice carrying across the crowd, "holds the truth. It shows how this man," he pointed at Locke, "poisoned the river. It shows the names of those who helped him. It shows the dates, the places. We do not come for war. We come for justice." A murmur rippled through the crowd. People looked at each other, uncertain. Hakan called out for Joaquin, a nervous ranch hand who had been standing near the back of the crowd. "You know what is in this book. Tell them." Joaquin's face went white. He tried to back away, but the weight of hundreds of eyes, settler and native alike, pinned him in place. Under that pressure, something in him broke. "It's true," he stammered, his voice cracking. Locke ordered the waste dumped into the river. He said it was cheaper than hauling it to the waste pits behind the mill. He forced Jan to haul barrels at first, but John quit when he found out what was in 'em. Locke hired me and others after that. He said if we didn't do it, he'd have us killed. I seen what happened to men who crossed him. The crowd erupted in angry shouts. The wall of horses tightened, closing in. Locke's empire began to crumble. Locke's face twisted. His hand shot out, snatching a revolver from Max Crow's holster. He raised it, his hand shaking with rage, and fired at Hakon. The shot grazed Hakon's side, tearing through fabric and skin, burning like fire. Several warriors fired back instinctively, bullets kicking up snow around Locke's feet, clipping his hat and dropping Max Crow into the snow with a bullet in his leg. In the chaos, Locke lunged into the barn, moving faster than his age suggested. He grabbed Ruth, who was still dazed from hitting her head, and dragged her out with the gun pressed against her temple. Her small body jerked with each step as he hauled her toward the riverbank behind the buildings. "Back off!" he screamed, voice cracking, spit flying. "I walk away, or she dies, I swear it." The crowd fell silent. Ruth's eyes were wide with terror, her breath coming in short gasps. She looked at her father, then at Hakon, then at Esther, pleading silently. John's wrists still chafed from rope, but now cut free by a horrified Virgil, stumbled after them. His body ached, every step agony, but he pushed forward. Hakon, bleeding from his side, moved in a slow half-circle, trying to keep Locke talking. The warriors did not advance, but they did not retreat either. They were a wall waiting. John saw an opening, a patch of uneven ice near the river's edge, where the current ran fast and the freeze was thin. He had fished there as a boy before everything went wrong, and he knew the ice was treacherous. He met Ruth's eyes, trying to tell her without words what he was about to do. Then he looked at Locke. "You want someone?" John shouted, his voice hoarse. "Take me. Let her go. I'm the one you want." Locke laughed, a wild, broken sound. You're nothing. You were always nothing." Jan took a step closer, then another. "Maybe. But I'm her father." With a hoarse shout, John body-checked Locke from the side, using the last of his strength. He slammed into the cattle baron with all his weight, shoving Ruth free. The gun went off, the sound deafening. The bullet buried itself in John's chest, punching through his coat and into his lung. Blood bloomed across his shirt. Locke and John tumbled together onto the brittle river ice. The surface groaned a deep, ominous sound. Cracks spiderwebbed beneath them. Locke scrambled, trying to get away, his boots slipping. John grabbed him, holding on, refusing to let go, even as the ice gave way. They plunged into the black water together. The cold hit like a fist, driving the air from their lungs. Locke shrieked, flailing, but his heavy wool coat and pistol belt dragged him down. Jan, already dying from the bullet, did not fight. The current swept them under the ice, and neither man surfaced. Ruth crawled forward on hands and knees, screaming, "Papa, Papa." She reached the edge, but Hakon was there, pulling her back, holding her as she fought and sobbed. Esther ran, slipping and skidding across the ice. But she knew before she reached them that it was too late. She knelt at the edge, staring at the black water, and felt a grief so heavy it threatened to crush her. The warriors lowered their weapons. The townsfolk stood in shocked silence. Virgil, shaking, tore his tin star from his vest and dropped it in the snow. "I'm done," he said to no one in particular, his voice hollow. Weeks passed. The dam that Locke had secretly built upstream, diverting water and concentrating the mercury runoff, was torn down under army orders. The poisoned tailings at Copper Creek were sealed off with clay and stone, preventing further contamination. Hakon and other warriors guided army engineers to the worst spots, showing them dead fish, the small graves of children, the evidence that could not be denied. Captain Dorian filed a detailed report, backed by Esther's testimony, Joaquin's confession, and the ledger itself. The document was sent east, where it made its way to the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Interior Department. Locke's holdings were seized to pay damages. Some of that compensation, under pressure from the Army and the Tribal Council, went to John's now orphaned daughter. Ruth moved in with Esther and Guinevere, who shared a small house at the edge of town. The two women taught her reading and writing, arithmetic, and medicine. Ruth was a quiet child now, haunted by what she had seen, but she was also determined. She would not let her father's sacrifice be in vain. The barn that almost burned became something new. Guinevere turned it into a rough school and meeting hall, a place where settler children and native children could sit side by side on hay bales, tracing letters in chalk under her patient gaze. The walls were patched, the roof repaired, and a small stove installed to keep out the worst of the cold. On cold mornings, Ruth helped stack firewood, moving more carefully where her father once stood. She would pause sometimes, staring at the spot where he had died, and whisper a few words, a prayer, a promise, a goodbye. Esther never interrupted her. Grief, the doctor knew, had its own timeline. Warriors no longer surrounded the place in an unbroken ring, but Hakan kept a rotating guard nearby. Not for intimidation, for protection. The barn and the stretch of river behind it, where John fell, were now a shared responsibility, a symbol of what could be built when people chose to stand together. One evening, Esther sat at her table with the ledger, preparing it to be sent east as evidence for the final legal proceedings. A loose page slipped free from the back cover, stuck there with old wax that had cracked with age. She unfolded it carefully. On it was a short contract amendment in Lakka's own hand, dated more than a year prior. Teamster Janek refused to dump tailings at fish beds, cited conscience and harm to children. Hired alternate crew at extra cost. Janek now considered unreliable and a danger to the operation. Locke had kept it as proof of Jan's insubordination, perhaps intending to use it in court someday to discredit him. Now it became proof of something else entirely Jan had tried. He had said no. Esther's hands trembled as she held the paper. She walked through the snowy streets to the barn and found Ruth inside, sweeping the floor by lamplight. "Ruth," Esther said gently, "I found something." She handed the girl the paper. Ruth read the lines slowly, her lips moving. Tears rimmed her eyes, but for the first time in weeks she stood straighter. "He said no," Ruth murmured, her voice breaking. "He tried to stop it." Esther nodded, her own eyes wet. "He did. He wasn't perfect, Ruth. He made mistakes. But when he learned the truth, he tried to make it right. And in the end, he gave everything to save you." Ruth folded the paper carefully and pressed it to her chest. "I want to keep this. It's yours," Esther said. Hakan appeared in the doorway, then silent as always. He had been checking the perimeter, making sure the guards were in place. He saw the tears on Ruth's face and the paper in her hands, and he understood. He untied a small pouch from his belt and placed it in Ruth's palm. Inside lay Winema's beaded necklace, the one that had risen and fallen with her breath the night Ruth found her. "This belonged to the woman you covered with your blanket," he said. "She said your barn was her shelter, so now it is ours too." Ruth looked up at him, this warrior who had ridden through storms and bullets to keep a promise, and she felt something inside her begin to heal. They walked together to the riverbank, where the ice was thinning and the first dark waters showed beneath the crust. Spring was coming slowly but surely. On the ridge above, a long line of mounted warriors waited in silence. Not for battle this time, but for a farewell. Winema's ashes, prepared according to the traditions of her people, were scattered into the current. The gray flecks swirled past the spot where John fell, then drifted toward open country, carried by the slow movement of the thawing river. Ruth stood between Hakon and Guinevere, clutching the necklace. 700 warriors looked down over her barn, not as an army of vengeance, but as a promise the little girl who once gave her only blanket to a freezing elder would never stand alone again. Spring came slowly to Cold Creek. The snow melted in patches, revealing muddy earth and the first brave shoots of grass. The river ran clear again, no longer choked with poison. Fish returned their silver bodies flashing in the current. Children played on its banks without fear, their laughter a sound that had been absent too long. Ruth grew taller, quieter, more serious. She learned to read better under Guinevere's teaching, mastering not just letters, but ideas, history, medicine. She learned to ride from Hakon, who visited often. He taught her how to sit a horse properly, how to read the land, how to move quietly through the forest. He did not coddle her, did not treat her as fragile, and she respected him for it. On summer evenings, when the air was soft and the light lasted long, she would sit on the barn steps and watch the horizon, remembering the night she dragged a dying woman across the snow. She did not regret it. Not for a moment. That choice made by a frightened child in the freezing dark had changed everything. The warriors did not line up outside her barn every day, but they did not need to. The promise had been made, and it held. When Ruth turned 10, Hakon brought her a knife, a good one, and taught her how to use it. When she turned 12, he brought her a rifle and taught her to shoot straight. She would not be helpless. She would not be prey. Ruth kept the gray blanket, the one she had given to Winema. Esther had washed it and mended the holes with careful stitches, and now it hung on a peg inside the barn-turned-schoolhouse. On cold nights, Ruth would wrap it around her shoulders and feel the weight of all the people who had stood for her, her father who had died to save her, Hakon who had ridden through a storm to keep a promise, Esther who had fought for the truth when no one else would, Guinevere who had risked everything to send that telegram, and Winema who had said that the barn was safe together. And so it was. Years later, when Ruth was 15, a traveling journalist came through Cold Creek collecting stories about the West. He interviewed her, asking about the incident with the Indians that had made it into the Eastern papers. Ruth, now taller and confident, looked him in the eye. "It wasn't an incident," she said. "It was a reckoning. And it started because someone was cold and I had a blanket." The journalist blinked, confused. "That's all." Ruth smiled, a sad but genuine expression. "That's everything." She never married, though she had offers. She became a teacher like Guinevere, and later a doctor like Esther, one of the first native-trained physicians in the territory. She spoke 3 languages, English, Czech, and Lakota, and she moved freely between the settler and native communities, a bridge in a divided land. On her 20th birthday, Hakon rode into town with a gift, a finely crafted saddle, worked leather and silver, beautiful and practical. She hugged him, this man who had become her second father, and felt the circle close. "You kept your promise," she said. "We both did," Hakon replied. The barn still stands even now. It is older, the wood weathered, the roof patched many times. But it is still there, a schoolhouse and meeting hall, a place where people gather to learn and talk and remember. On the wall inside, next to the gray blanket, hangs a small brass plaque. It reads, "In memory of John Janek, who said no when it mattered, and Winema, who taught us that shelter is not just walls, but the people who stand within them." And every winter, when the first snow falls and the river begins to freeze, the children of Cold Creek, settler and native alike, gather in the barn and listen as Ruth tells them a story. It is a story about a little girl, a freezing elder, and a blanket. It is a story about choices and consequences and the way small acts of kindness can change the world. And it is a story that begins like this. The last light of evening bled over the frozen river near the town of Cold Creek.